A 70-year-old woman set fire to her own kitchen on purpose. She was chained by the ankle to the stove, and she knew she would never get away from the flames. That was the point. She did not want to escape. She wanted to die there on the stone floor before they came back for her and took her up the stairs to the room at the top of the house from which, as every enslaved person in that household whispered to one another, no one ever came down again. It was the morning of the 10th of April, 1834. The house stood on the most elegant corner of the French Quarter, with wrought iron balconies and carved doors, and it belonged to one of the most admired hostesses in the city. A woman of good family and great fortune, with manners no one ever questioned. People who passed her on the street greeted her with deference. When the men who came to put out the fire broke down the doors at the back, they found locks 7 inches across, thick as a man's fist. They found iron shutters nailed over the windows, and behind them, they found what the city had pretended not to see for 6 years. This is a disturbing story about a house that looked like everything people wanted to believe, and about what lived locked away on the other side of the walls, a few feet from the dinner tables where the finest wine in New Orleans was poured. There is a corner in New Orleans that almost every tourist walks past without knowing. It sits where Royal Street crosses Governor Nichols, which in the time of this story was still called Hospital Street. The building is large, gray, 3 stories tall, with a balcony that juts out over the sidewalk like the deck of a ship run aground on dry land. The shutters are usually closed. The street there is quiet in a way that does not match the rest of the quarter. People cross to the other side without realizing they are crossing. And when they stop, it is because someone stopped before them and began to tell the story. The house standing there today is not the same house as this story. The original was destroyed, and what you see now was rebuilt on the ruins years later. But the place is the same. The ground is the same, and it is from that ground that everything begins. It is worth lingering a moment on that facade, because that is exactly how it worked. From the outside, order, beauty. Black and white marble in the entrance hall, a curving staircase climbing through all 3 floors, crystal chandeliers, plaster rosettes on the ceiling, everything arranged so that the eye of whoever entered would catch on the surface and have no reason to look any deeper. It was a house built to be admired and not examined. And for a while, no one examined it. The woman who had it built had a rare talent for that, for creating a surface so convincing that the right question never came to be asked. She received guests, she smiled, she offered her arm at the door, she asked after the children of people she met on the street. She was watched with envy for her fortune and with respect for her lineage. And behind all of it, there was a back wing where the windows had iron bars and the doors had locks far too large for a house where, in theory, only one family and its servants lived. Why would a private home need locks like that? That question hung in the air for years without anyone wanting to answer it. The French Quarter in those days lived under a strange tension. The city had changed hands only a few decades before, from the Spanish to the French, from the French to the Americans, and each group distrusted the next. The Creoles, descended from the old European families, still ran social life. The Americans, newly arrived, ran more and more of the business. Whoever lived on that corner belonged to the old side, the side that considered itself above all suspicion. And that was precisely the problem. Above suspicion is a dangerous place for a person to live, because it means that when the first rumors begin to spread, they will strike a wall of polite disbelief and bounce back. That is what happened. For years, neighbors saw things, heard things, murmured about them in their own homes. And still, the lady of Royal Street kept riding out in her carriage every afternoon, with her well-fed, glossy-skinned coachman on the box for the usual drive along the lakeshore. The story I am going to reconstruct here did not come from legend. It came from the newspapers of the time, from testimony sworn before magistrates, from family letters kept for generations, from notarial and death records. There are parts that are known for certain. There are parts where the sources disagree, and I point those out as they come. Because inventing what is not known would be too easy. And that ease is exactly what turned this case into a macabre fairy tale in the hands of those who came later. Whatever is invention from the centuries that followed gets named as invention on the spot. What remains, once the exaggeration is stripped away, is already enough to keep you awake. Let us begin with the essential. Between 1830 and 1834, the city's death records noted the deaths of 12 enslaved people inside that mansion. 12. The papers do not say of what, only that they died there in those 4 years. 12 deaths in a single house, over a short span, was not something that went unnoticed in a place where enslaved people were treated as property and counted with the care of someone counting money. It was a number that demanded an explanation, and no one, at the time, demanded one. Why not? That is the most uncomfortable question of the whole case, because it has nothing to do with the woman in that house. It has to do with the entire city around her. The house had a roof of steep slopes, and from the eaves down to the stone courtyard, it was a long fall. Hold the image of that facade for a moment. So clean, so calm, so convincing. And the question almost no one asked in time. If everything there was exactly what it seemed, why so many locks? Why so much iron over the windows? And what, after all, needed to be kept so well hidden in a house where, officially, there was nothing to hide? To answer that, first you have to know the woman who held all the keys. She was born on the 19th of March, 1787, in a New Orleans that was still a colony of the Spanish crown. Her baptismal name was Marie Delphine McCarty, and the surname alone already opened every door in the city. The McCartys were among the oldest and richest families in the place. They had come from Ireland generations earlier, shortened the surname, married into the best Creole houses, and rooted themselves at the top of society. When Delphine was born, to be a McCarty meant to be born with your life settled and your respect guaranteed. To understand how much, just look at the relatives. An uncle of hers, by marriage, had been governor of the Spanish provinces of Louisiana and Florida. A cousin would be mayor of New Orleans for 5 years. The child growing up on that riverfront plantation, surrounded by servants and powerful kin, learned early a lesson she would carry her whole life, that people like her gave the orders, and the rest of the world obeyed. Violence between masters and the enslaved was no abstraction for the McCartys either. Decades before Delphine was born, an uncle of hers had been killed by the people he enslaved, and it was said in the family that her mother had met the same end. She grew up in a world where the fear and the brutality between the two ends of slavery had already come through the front door. At 13, she married for the first time. The groom was a high-ranking Spanish royal officer, much older, and the ceremony took place in the Cathedral of St. Louis. It was a marriage of scandal and haste, and it did not last long. While traveling on official business, the husband died suddenly near Havana, and a few days later, Delphine gave birth to her first daughter. She returned to New Orleans a widow, a mother, and still very young. Her second husband was Jean Blanc, banker, lawyer, legislator, and one of the most influential figures in the city. He bought a house for the family and had 4 children with her. He was also a major trafficker of human beings and did business with the Lafitte brothers, the most famous pirates of the Gulf. This was the world Delphine moved through in her maturity. A world where fortune and the trade in people were merely 2 rooms of the same house. Blanc died leaving heavy debts, and Delphine did not go under. She managed the estate, collected what was hers, made good deals, received an inheritance from her father, and within a few years she was once again among the richest women in the city. She depended on no husband for anything. She ran her own property, bought land, commanded dozens of enslaved people in her own name. In an age when a woman was expected to be decorative and silent, she was an owner and a mistress of her own affairs. A woman with more power and more money than most of the men around her made a great many people uneasy, even before any crime. In 1831, she bought a lot on the corner of Royal Street and Hospital Street. There was already a building under construction there. The following year, she had the 2-story mansion that would enter history raised on the spot, a lavish residence, with quarters for the enslaved attached at the back. And it is in that back wing that the iron appears. The doors to the enslaved people's quarters had locks 7 inches across. The windows had solid iron shutters. To anyone who knew the Creole residences of the time, that stood out. Great houses did have servants' wings, but not locks like those, nor bars like those. That wing was built to contain, so that what was inside could not get out, and what was outside could not see in. No one, at the time, read that as a warning sign. They read it as the eccentricity of a wealthy woman. And that is one of the most disturbing things about the whole case. The evidence was in plain sight, fixed into the very structure of the house, years before the fire. All anyone had to do was read the iron. On the outside, life followed the perfect script. Delphine gave crowded dinners. She kept a central place in high society. She was remembered as a consummate hostess, able to speak as an equal with the richest men in the city about business, and the same night, charm the whole table. Her older daughters, some guests said, seemed dim beside her, but Delphine shone. There was a gesture of hers that the guests liked to repeat as proof of her kindness. During dinner, she would leave a little wine in her glass and pass it, with a gentle word, to the enslaved man serving behind her chair. People saw that and concluded she was a generous lady, concerned for her own. It was exactly the kind of scene that made any accusation unthinkable. How could you suspect a woman who shares her own wine? Every afternoon, at the appointed hour, her carriage stopped at the door. Delphine would step in and ride out along the bayou road, the white road of crushed shells that followed the bayou to the lake. It was a social outing. The whole neighborhood promenaded there at dusk, and her carriage was part of the scenery, with the enslaved coachman on the box, a man named Bastien, healthy-looking and well-kept. That coachman was, without anyone noticing, a central piece of her silent defense. Whenever someone dared to hint that the lady of Royal Street mistreated her enslaved people, all they had to do was point to Bastien. Look at the coachman. The glossy skin, the sturdy build. Would a cruel woman keep the man who drives her through the city, in full view of everyone, in such a state? The argument seemed unanswerable. It was unanswerable because it was wrong for the right reason. Bastien was the display, what she wanted seen. The back wing was the storeroom, what she did not want seen. And the city, satisfied with the display, never wanted to open the storeroom. Everything, up to this point, worked in her favor. The name, the money, the manners, the shared wine, the healthy coachman. Each piece on its own is innocent. Each piece on its own disarms suspicion. That is how it worked. There was no single brilliant disguise. There were dozens of small proofs of respectability, stacked up until they formed a wall no rumor could get through. And rumors did exist. They were already circulating. By this point, neighbors had begun to talk in low voices about what went on in that house. But talking in low voices, in a city that did not want to listen, is the same as silence. Before we come to what the neighbors were seeing, we need to meet one more person from that house. The man who slept in the same bed as Delphine and whom history, for a long time, treated as the true monster of the story. The husband. If this reconstruction has you hooked, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. The next part introduces the man whom history, for nearly 2 centuries, blamed in her place. And you, like almost everyone who has ever known this case, will probably point your finger at the wrong person. His name was Louis LaLaurie. He was a doctor. And it is his name, not hers, that hangs on the front of that house to this day. Louis arrived in New Orleans in February of 1825, coming from Bordeaux aboard a ship called the Fanny. He was 22 years old, freshly graduated in medicine, and came from the middle-class family of a French village. An ambitious young man, after a fortune in the New World. Nothing about him, at first glance, announced tragedy. The specialty he advertised in the newspapers is the first detail that makes your stomach tighten once you already know the ending. Louis presented himself as a doctor who could straighten crooked backs and correct deformities of the body, a man whose profession was to take limbs and spines out of place and force them back into a shape considered correct. Louis and Delphine may have met in a way that ties the two ends of this story together. One of her daughters is on record as having a physical disability. Letters from the LaLaurie family itself refer to one of the young women as the hunchbacked girl, and it is possible that the young doctor of deformities was first called in to treat that girl, that the man entered Delphine's life through the door of a crooked body he promised to fix. It is not known for certain whether it happened that way, and the sources leave it open. But the daughter's disability is on record, his professional advertisement is on record, and the two of them lived under the same roof. What is known is that, by the end of 1826, the relationship between the two had become intimate, and Delphine was pregnant. The couple's son was born in August of 1827. The marriage was only made official months later, in January of 1828. Delphine was then about 40 years old and already a grandmother. Louis was in his early 20s. 15 years separated them. The marriage contract tells a story on its own. Delphine insisted on keeping, in her own name, control of all the property, real estate, money, and enslaved people, adding up to something around $67,000. Louis entered the marriage with about $2,000, and even that was tied up in his late mother's estate. She was the fortune. He was the addition. And the paper recorded it in ink. In an age when the man was expected to rule the house, that said a great deal. In that house, she ruled. The property was hers. The enslaved people were hers. The decisions were hers. Louis occupied a place that society reserved for wives. He was the one who stood in the back of the portrait. The accounts of those who lived near the couple are hard on him. A plantation manager named Jean Bose, who sent gossipy letters to an employer in France, wrote still in the first year of the marriage that the two did not make a happy household. They fought, they separated, they came back together, and gave the impression that one day they would abandon each other for good. That is more or less what happened. In 1832, Delphine went to court asking for a separation. She claimed her husband had treated her in a way that made living together unbearable, and that, before witnesses, he had beaten and wounded her. The accusations were confirmed by her own children. The separation, however, was not final, because on the day of the fire, 2 years later, Louis was in the house. Then again, Louis spent a good deal of his time away. He declared before a notary that his practice required him to spend most of his time in Plaquemines Parish, a remote area. It is hard to believe that a specialist in correcting deformities was building a career in orthopedics out in that backwater instead of setting up an office in the city. The suspicion that remains is simple. Perhaps he only wanted distance from her. And here is the trap almost everyone falls into. A doctor who works on bodies. A husband present on the day of the tragedy. A man whose profession was to force limbs into new positions. Put those pieces together, and the conclusion seems obvious. The monster of that house must have been him. The cold doctor who used the enslaved as test subjects for his experiments. It is a clean story, a satisfying one, and the kind the public loves, because it turns the violence into a man's mad science. Almost all of it is wrong. The enslaved people were hers, not his. They were in her name on the contract. The one who bought them, sold them, punished them, and locked them away was her. The accusations of cruelty from before that marriage fell on her. Louis, in the words of those who watched him closely, barely appears in the accounts of his radiant wife. A chronicler of the time even noted that he had nothing to do with the management of her property, and that for this reason he was not mixed up in her disgraces. This does not clear him, and it is important to say so plainly. He was in the house. He slept there. He was a doctor. It was impossible to live with that and not know. His silence was complicity, even if the hands that fastened the chains were not his. No proof links him directly to the torture, and no proof suggests he tried to stop it. He knew and he kept quiet. But the one who ran that house with will and with fury was her. So why does the house carry his name to this day? For a reason that says a great deal about how that society thought. It was easier to believe in a cruel man than in a cruel woman. A violent man fit into their world. A violent woman, Catholic, a mother, a hostess of the best society, did not fit. So the blame slid, over time, onto the masculine name. Because the masculine name was the only one the collective imagination could carry without collapsing. For now, what matters is this. You have just ruled out the wrong suspect. The person who held the iron keys was the same one who shared the wine at the table, and while the city debated the troubled marriage of that strange couple, the neighbors of Royal Street were beginning to see, through the slats of the shutters, things they could no longer deny. Domestic horror rarely reveals itself all at once. It tends to leak out little by little, in things too small to denounce on their own. A sound that cannot be explained. A child seen once and never again. A window that should be open and is found nailed shut. On Royal Street it was like that, in slow motion for years. The whole neighborhood noticed the back wing. Those enormous locks, those iron bars, did not go unnoticed by anyone living right next door. In a city where servants' wings were common and well known, the one on Delphine's house was different enough to draw comment. But comment on its own does not bring down a reputation built over generations. Her enslaved people, said those who saw them up close, looked strangely downcast and miserable compared to those of other houses. In front of others, there were no obvious signs of beating, only that air of worn-out people. eaten away by their own existence, and in front of others, she seemed kind to them. On the surface, it all held together. That is why the gesture with the wine worked so well as a shield, and why another scene, even more telling, slipped past. It was said that Delphine kept the cook chained near the stove, and that she beat her own daughters when they tried to feed the starving enslaved people, or to slip food to those she kept without eating. A mother punishing her daughters for an act of compassion. Whoever heard it, and some people did, preferred to treat it as gossip blown out of proportion. The cook chained to the stove, for now, is one more cruel rumor among many. There was a phrase that circulated among the household's enslaved people and leaked out past the walls. They said that those taken up to the highest room of the mansion never came back. It was said just like that, plain, without an adjective. They went up and did not come down. In a house where 12 people died in 4 years, with no recorded cause, that phrase was not superstition. It was bookkeeping. The death records keep names, and the names weigh more than the numbers. Among the dead of those years was a woman named Bonne, a cook and washerwoman, who died early in 1833, and there were her 4 children. Juliette, 13 years old. Florence, 10. Jules, 6. And the youngest, Leontine, 2 years old. A whole family wiped out inside that house, child after child, over a short span, with the papers leaving out any explanation. A 2-year-old girl. The documents do not say how she died. They say only where and when, and that she was 2. The rest, the city decided not to ask. Put the iron wing together, the downcast enslaved people, the chained cook, the phrase about the room no one came back from, and the 12 deaths with children's names among them. All of it on the table at once, and the figure that forms is unmistakable. The problem is that no one put it all on the table at once. Each piece appeared in isolation, on a different day and in the mouth of a different person, and in isolation it could be dismissed. That was the mechanism of the silence. No grand cover-up had to be staged. The proof scattered across time and across people, and no one ever held the whole picture in their hand. And the wall of respectability did the rest. Anyone who wanted to believe that everything was fine had 1,000 polite reasons to believe it. There was, even so, someone who would not swallow it. A neighbor named Montreuil, a man from her own circle, tried more than once to bring the matter to light. He pressed, he looked for a way to prove it, he came back at it again. And time after time, no one wanted to believe him. A gentleman accusing a lady of his own circle was an embarrassment that society preferred not to have. The effect of that was perverse. The victim of the social judgment was not the enslaved people being tortured in the back wing. It was the lady's reputation, supposedly being unfairly stained by rumors. The city had completely inverted who needed protecting, and in that inversion, which looked like nothing more than good manners, sat the gear that kept the machine running. And it is fair to ask one thing about the neighbors themselves. Why did the woman at the window next door, and the law student, and Montreuil, and so many others who sensed something, not shout louder? The answer is uncomfortable, and it is part of the horror. They lived off the same system. Almost everyone of means in that city owned people. To accuse Delphine of extreme cruelty was to open a dangerous door, because on the other side of it was the question of where acceptable cruelty ended and unacceptable cruelty began. It was safer to treat her as an isolated case, an aberration, than to admit that she was only the visible tip of something they were all caught up in. That is the key the public tends not to see. Delphine did what she did because she had almost absolute power over human bodies, and almost no real chance of answering for it. People capable of such cruelty exist in every age. What changes is how much power the world places in their hands, and how much silence it offers in return. There was, however, a moment when the law actually entered that house. It began with a child, a whip, and a fall that a neighbor swore she saw from her own window. It was the first time the truth nearly walked out the front door. And what the law did with it, that day, says more about that city than any cruelty of Delphine's. The story that almost brought it all down begins at a staircase window. The house next door, on the east side, had a window from which you could see down into the small inner courtyard of Delphine's mansion. And it was from there that a woman one day saw something she could not forget. She said she heard the sharp scream of a child and ran to the window. In the courtyard, she saw a small enslaved girl, maybe 8 years old, run across the space in a panic and disappear into the house. Behind her, whip in hand, came Delphine. The neighbor did not see the rest through the glass, but she heard it. The commotion climbing from floor to floor, from gallery to gallery, the little fugitive fleeing up the stairs with her mistress on her heels, until the two of them came out onto the roof. And there, according to the account, the girl slipped down the slopes of the roof, reached the edge, and fell, a long way down to the stone floor of the courtyard. It is the same steep-sloped roof of the house on the corner, and the same long fall to the courtyard stone. The neighbor said she stayed at the window, that she saw, hours later, in the dark, a lit torch, a shallow hole dug in the courtyard floor, and the small body being buried right there, at night. And that she then went to the authorities. That account, though, has a limit, and it is at that limit that the legend later grew. It came from a single witness and was recorded by a chronicler who visited the city 2 years after the fire, gathering what was passed from mouth to mouth. When the courtyard was actually dug up, researchers pointed out that no child's body was ever conclusively found at that spot. The fall may have happened as the neighbor swore, or it may have been memory stretched by the collective horror. Both are possible, and it would be dishonest to sell you either one as a certainty. What is not rumor, and is on record, is what came after the accusations, and that is where the story gets truly revealing. There was an investigation. The house was the subject of an inquiry for cruelty against the enslaved, and according to the accounts, this time a verdict of guilt was reached. The enslaved people she was mistreating were taken from her and brought to the market to be sold. The law, at last, had acted. And then came the trick. A relative of Delphine's showed up at the market, bought those same people and returned them to her. All within the law, the punishment was carried out on paper, and in practice nothing changed at all. The victims went back to the house they had been taken from, into the same hands that had hurt them. The law had drawn a perfect circle that ended exactly where it began. For those locked in that wing, the message was clear. The law came to the house, took those people away from her, and a few days later handed them back to the same hands. What hope is left after that? Whoever lived there learned, in the worst way, that no help was coming from the outside. And the documents hold more than that episode. They hold an entire history. Years earlier, back in the late 1820s, Delphine's abuses had come to light a first time. On one occasion, enslaved people were reportedly found still bloody in her house. In 1829, she went to trial and was acquitted by an indulgent jury. What survived was a receipt, dated that June, for fees paid to one of the most famous lawyers in the city for her defense in a criminal case. $300 for the defense against the state. In 1832, again, she was indicted for mistreatment and, according to the accounts, got herself off by paying a sum of money. The criminal records of that period were lost over time, so we do not have the full case files. But the pattern is clear enough. There was an accusation in 1828, an acquittal in 1829, and a new indictment in 1832. 3 times the machinery of justice brushed against her, and all 3 times she slipped free, untouched. Now set that against what the city was saying. The public version was that Delphine, at most, was too harsh in disciplining her own, that she had already paid dearly for it, and that she would surely stop. The version in the documents is that she had been accused of cruelty for at least 6 years, escaping each case by money or by influence. There was method to it, and the method had been running for years. Nothing showed the law's helplessness before her better than what came next. Faced with the rumors, a lawyer in the city decided to send a young law student to the house with the task of reminding Delphine, in plain terms, of the laws that protected enslaved people from mistreatment. The young man went. He spoke with her, and he came back enchanted. He left full of indignation against anyone who dared to suspect that amiable woman, convinced that she could not harm a fly. She would arrange to have herself warned, and the warners themselves came back turned into her defenders. That is how her armor rebuilt itself, every time someone tried to open a crack. Her respectability did more than sit there as a disguise. It worked, turning investigators into admirers in the space of a single visit. And that is why what happened on the 10th of April, 1834, was so decisive. Because it did not come from an inquiry, a witness, an accusation, things she knew how to dismantle. It came from inside. It came from a 70-year-old woman, chained to a stove, who understood that no one from outside was going to save her, and decided that, if the only thing she had left in the world was to light a flame, then she would light the biggest flame she could. Justice had failed 3 times. The fire would not fail. The morning of the 10th of April, 1834, began with smoke pouring out of the kitchen of the Royal Street mansion. Despite the legal separation requested 2 years earlier, husband and wife were both in the house that day. The fire began where it had to begin, in the kitchen, where the 70-year-old cook lived chained to the stove by an iron chain. On the length of that chain, the sources disagree. One of the chroniclers said 24 feet. Another record says 8 feet. What no one disputes is the essential part. She was chained by the ankle to the stove, with no way to leave that spot on her own 2 feet. When they questioned her afterward, she told them why she had done it. She said she set the fire in an attempt to take her own life, because she feared being punished. And she said the phrase that confirmed every rumor at once, that the enslaved people taken to the highest room of the house never came back. She chose the fire over climbing those stairs. That is the size of what was up there. The room from which, according to the enslaved, no one came down stopped being a neighborhood whisper. It became testimony, spoken by someone who lived inside the house. The smoke drew people, neighbors, friends, strangers, all running to the corner. And because it was known in the neighborhood that the upper part of the wing was used as a prison, and that there were enslaved people locked up there, those who arrived first had only one concern: to get those people out before the fire reached them. That is where the mask first fell in public. Among those who came to help was a judge, Canonge, who politely asked Delphine and her husband for the keys to the enslaved people's quarters, to move them to a place of safety. The keys were refused. Louis LaLaurie answered with contempt that certain people would do better to mind their own affairs than to come meddling in other people's houses. The house was burning. There were people locked inside, and the family's response was to refuse the keys and insult the one who asked. The refusal was cold and calculated. They knew exactly what would be found if those doors were opened, and they preferred to risk the locked people burning over letting them be seen. Refusing the keys was, perhaps, the most damning act in the whole story because it admits no innocent explanation. The flames were spreading. Faced with the refusal, the order was given to break down the doors, and here, at last, the iron from the first chapter does its work. The 7-inch locks, the bars, the metal shutters, all of it that for years had seemed nothing more than a wealthy woman's eccentricity, was now what stood between the men and what lay on the other side. They had to break bars, force doors, tear down what had been built to contain. When the doors gave way, what was behind them silenced the whole street. What the serious newspapers printed the next day and the sworn witnesses recorded is enough on its own. None of the grotesque embellishment that grew up later is needed here. They found 7 enslaved people in varying states of mutilation and neglect. They were chained, marked, held in positions that kept them motionless. Some wore iron collars. They had, according to the account, been kept there for months, kept alive only long enough to prolong their own suffering. Among them was a young man who declared he had been chained for 5 months, fed a handful of meal a day, and abused every morning. There was a woman in an iron collar, chained by the feet, and another shut in the kitchen itself. An elderly black woman was found collapsed under a mosquito net, with a deep wound in her head, too weak to get up, and a man had an open wound in his head and his body marked with scars from end to end. The husband was the doctor who promised, in the newspapers, to straighten crooked backs and correct deformities of the body. What was found in that wing were bodies forced into unnatural positions, limbs twisted and bound, people held in shapes no body chooses. His professional advertisement and what lay behind those doors fit together on their own. The victims were taken out and carried to the Cabildo, the seat of power on the central square, where they were given food, water, and medical care. And here something happens that says everything about the impact of it on the city. The news spread, and the people came to look. The accounts speak of as many as 4,000 people filing past to look at those rescued people, to convince themselves with their own eyes of what had happened a few feet from the most elegant parties in New Orleans. 4,000 people. The same city that for 6 years did not want to see a single victim, now lined up to see them all. The truth was the same as ever. What changed was its location. It came out of the back wing and ended up in the center of the square, where there was no more pretending. The corroboration was immediate and came from people of weight. The judge who entered the house gave sworn testimony, published in the newspaper 2 days later. The French consul sent a report to the authorities of his country. A notary who helped carry the victims out confirmed what he saw. A jurist and historian described the people being carried on stretchers, their skin changed in color, barely breathing. It was no neighbor's rumor. It was recorded by men whose words carried official weight. That is why all of it survived the years. And the newspaper The Bee, writing about those people, called them the property of a demon in the shape of a woman. The phrase shows how, the moment the truth appeared, the city ran to the opposite of what it had done until then. Suddenly, from a woman above all suspicion, she became a demon. The two extremes served the same purpose, keeping her outside the human, before too human to suspect, now too monstrous to be one of them. While the crowd grew outside the house, waiting for the guilty woman's arrest, inside it Delphine did what she had always known how to do better than anyone. She kept calm. By the accounts, during the fire she stayed perfectly composed, directing those who arrived to save the silver, the jewels, the fine furniture, drawing attention away from the back wing with courtesy. "Save the valuables," she said. "That over there is only the servants' part." And then, at the exact moment the street's fury was gathering, her carriage stopped at the door, as it stopped every afternoon, at the usual hour. Bastien, the glossy-skinned coachman, was on the box. Delphine crossed the sidewalk with the same manners as ever, stepped into the carriage, and the coachman whipped the horses. The glossy-skinned coachman, who for years had been living proof of her kindness, was exactly the one who drove the escape. The display became the getaway. And in a detail that says everything about who she was, even at that moment she did not free Bastien, not even him, who had just saved her. To Delphine, he remained what he had always been, useful property. The crowd tried to stop the carriage, to seize the horses, to overturn it. They could not. The horses bolted down Hospital Street and reached the Bayou Road, the same white road of shells where she rode out every afternoon, now cut through at high speed in the middle of the elegant evening traffic. The pursuit fell behind. At the end of the road, by the lakeshore, a schooner was waiting. She boarded and crossed the water toward Mandeville, on the other side. When the coachman tried to come back with the carriage, the crowd caught up with him. They killed the horses and tore the vehicle apart. And with the quarry out of their hands, they went back to the house. As night fell, they attacked the mansion and destroyed everything they found. Furniture, china, crystal, balustrades, all torn out, broken, thrown from the windows. They worked the whole night through until almost nothing was left but the walls. The most elegant house on the corner became a skeleton. The close of that day carried its own irony. The city that had refused for 6 years to lay a hand on Delphine spent a single night reducing her house to rubble. It was easier to destroy the building than to have done justice with its owner. The stone paid what the person did not, and the person herself, at that very moment, was already crossing the lake, free, toward a life that would end far away, on the other side of the ocean, without ever spending a single day in custody. The question that remains is a hard one. How did she escape all of it? To answer that, you have to count the bodies the documents never counted. On the day of the fire, Delphine owned about 30 people. After the escape, with her affairs being settled from a distance, 11 were sold, including the coachman Bastien. 19 remain. 19 human beings who were in that house, and who, in a time when enslaved people were recorded with the care of someone recording money, simply vanish from the papers. There is no sale, no transfer, no other record of any kind. That silence has a sinister weight. Among those 19 missing are, almost certainly, the victims themselves. The 7 people rescued alive, some of whom died a few days later and others left too mutilated to be sold. And those who were never rescued at all, because they had already died of starvation and torture before the fire. The 19 are the final fate of those who entered that wing and did not walk back out the door. The 12 recorded deaths, with the names of Bonnet and her 4 children among them, were only the part the papers admitted to. The 19 missing are the arithmetic continuation of that. The bookkeeping of that house never balanced, because it was made not to balance. Weeks after the fire, when the mansion's yard was dug up, bodies were said to have been unearthed, and a condemned well at the back to hold others, including that of a child. That account appeared in a newspaper of the time and was repeated later. It sits alongside the doubt about the girl on the roof, whose body, at that spot, was reportedly never confirmed. There were reports of bodies in the ground, and there were those who questioned them. The exact truth was lost along with the records, and anyone who tells you they are absolutely certain of the final number of dead is selling legend, not history. While the city dug up the yard, Delphine was already far away. From Mandeville, she and her husband put their affairs in order and gave power of attorney to her sons-in-law to manage what was left. From there, they went to Mobile, then to New York, and on the 24th of June, 1834, they set sail aboard a ship called the Poland, bound for the French port of Le Havre. One detail of that crossing says more than any verdict could. On board traveled an American poet, William Cullen Bryant, who noted in his journal that he had recognized that lady from New Orleans, the one who had committed those horrible cruelties against her enslaved people. He recorded that she seemed much affected by the coldness with which the other passengers treated her, and that she was often seen in tears. The woman who refused the keys while locked people stood in danger of burning wept on a ship because the other passengers wanted nothing to do with her. What wounded her was the contempt. The torture that had caused it seems never to have troubled her. In Paris, her life went on in comfort. She rented addresses in a fashionable neighborhood, frequented the spa towns of the Pyrenees, lived surrounded by the grown children who came to join her. There were money troubles, because one of her sons-in-law siphoned off her funds, and at some point she even planned to return to New Orleans to settle the accounts in person. The family talked her out of it. The idea of her setting foot in that city again filled her children with dread. And it is from a letter by one of her sons, Paulin, that the most disturbing detail of all about this woman's character comes. Writing to a brother-in-law, he spoke of his mother with the frankness of someone who knew her well. He said he had lived with her and studied her for years, and that time had changed nothing in that ungovernable nature. And he concluded, about the flight from New Orleans, that his mother had never truly grasped why she had been forced to leave at all. Her own son believed she never understood why she had to flee. There was no remorse because there was, in her mind, nothing to be sorry for. She had done what she always did with what was hers: punish the property. The idea that it was a monstrous crime seems never to have truly reached her. To Delphine, the scandal was something else, having been forced to leave the city over a thing she barely considered wrong. The husband vanished from the story. Louis separated from her for good, went to Cuba, and died in Havana years later, never reunited with his wife and son. The man legend turned into the chief villain ended as he had lived, a figure in the background, faded, who left the stage without anyone quite noticing. Her death is the last point where the sources quarrel, and the quarrel is revealing. The more delicious legend says Delphine died in France, gored by a boar on a hunt in 1842. It is a ghost story death, violent and poetic, the kind the public loves because it looks like the justice of fate. A copper plate found decades later in a New Orleans cemetery even bears that year, 1842. The Paris archives tell another thing, far less satisfying. They say she died on the 7th of December, 1849, after a long illness, in her own home, in an elegant neighborhood of the city. No bore, no dramatic punishment. Just a rich old woman dying in bed at 62, surrounded by comfort. The archives are almost certainly right, because the more uncomfortable truth nearly always is. She was not punished by fate. She died in peace. And even dead, she came home. Her remains were exhumed years later and brought back to New Orleans. to rest in a cemetery in the city, in a tomb tied to her son, Pauline. The woman who was driven out by the crowd ended up returning, in silence, to the land she had fled. The city that destroyed her house ended up keeping her bones. Now for the hardest question. Why did this case, among so many similar horrors of that time, become the most famous of them all? There were other cruel masters. There were abuses just as bad or worse, documented in other houses. And yet, it is the name of that corner that has crossed 2 centuries. The answer has little to do with the scale of the cruelty and much to do with who committed it. What shook that society was the author of the horror, a woman. Catholic, a mother, a hostess, of the best lineage, of the greatest beauty. She did not fit the idea that world had of itself. A violent man, they could explain. A violent woman, from the very top of society, threatened the image they held of the whole class of gentle, harmless ladies. So they had to turn her into an aberration, into a demon, into a single, unrepeatable monster. It was a way of protecting the rule, of saying, deep down, that their system was good and that only Delphine was rotten. And that is where the darkest part of all lies. She represents the far end of something the whole system allowed, and that it allowed all the more easily because it existed. Without one person's absolute power over the body of another, almost none of it could have happened. The villain of the story is real and guilty, and the documents leave no doubt of it. But behind her there is a whole city that saw the iron on the windows, counted the deaths, heard the screams, tried her 3 times, and chose every time to look away, until the day a 70-year-old woman, chained to a stove, decided she would rather have the fire than climb one more flight of those stairs. She lit the flame the city had not had the courage to light, and in its glare, everyone finally saw what had been there the whole time. The question that remains is not how a woman could be capable of that. People capable of it have always existed and always will. The question is another one, and it is harder to sleep beside. How many people had to close their eyes, and for how long, for it to last 6 years a few feet from the street? And how many houses today still have the back wing that no one wants to look at?